Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Kvexis, and I'm the Assistant Director for Programs here at the Salazar Center. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that the land we are on today is the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. We recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first in our webinar series on case studies in collaborative land conservation, lessons on tackling the climate change and biodiversity loss crises. Today's webinar, the first in our series, is setting the stage, understanding the Conservation Partnership Working Paper and its implications for climate change solutions. You should be able to find a link here soon for that working paper if you haven't already seen it and read it. This recent analysis put together by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy and the Network for Landscape Conservation examines how landscape conservation partnerships across the US are incorporating climate change into their work. Landscape conservation work is already facing many challenges, and climate change has just brought a whole other layer of complexity to the work. And that is what we will explore over the next 4 webinars. Before I introduce our fabulous speakers here for today, I have a few housekeeping notes for us to think about. First, we encourage you to submit questions and comments in our chat. We love hearing from our audience. We want to hear your input and thoughts. We will make sure to get through as many of those questions as we possibly can. I apologize in advance. We probably won't get through all of them, but we will do our best. Also, this session is being recorded, and we'll share the recording with all of the registrants after the event. And of course, I've already mentioned this is a 4-part series, so I want to make sure that you keep it on your radar the rest of the webinars that are happening over the course of the summer. Our next webinar will happen on June 29th. You should be able to find the registration link in the chat here soon as well. We'll be looking at innovative data and communication tools that landscape conservation organizations are using to incorporate climate into their work. And then lastly, I just wanted to remind all of you that the Salazar Center annually puts on its annual Symposium on Conservation Impact, which will be happening this fall in Denver. We will be picking up some of the threads of this webinar conversation and exploring how nature-positive approaches can help us meet both climate and biodiversity challenges across North America. We're going to be opening registration early in June, so please keep your eyes open for that. We'd love to see some of you there. Now to our panelists. Our first speaker today will be Ernest Cook, who is the director for the Network for Landscape Conservation and the principal author of the working paper that we're talking about today. He'll be followed by Stephanie Covino, the program manager at the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative and one of the case study participants. And last but not least, our moderator for today is Jim Levitt. Jim is the director of the International Land Conservation Network at the Lincoln Institute, which he co-founded in 2014. Jim was one of the driving forces behind getting this working paper off the ground. And with that, I'll pass the digital mic over to Jim to get us started.
Thank you, Jen. It's such a pleasure to be here. I'm going to present a very brief introduction for the paper that Ernest was the lead author for, which is called How Landscape Conservation Partnerships Are Working to Address Climate Change. The important thing that I want to deliver, next slide, please, is that this work was actually stimulated by an earlier piece of work done at the Lincoln Institute called From the Ground Up, How Land Trusts and Conservancies Are Providing Solutions to Climate Change. This was a survey of a dozen initiatives that occurred across the globe on 6 different continents, in Australia, in China, in Europe and Africa, South and North America. And given the response to that and the strong amount of interest, I talked to Ernest and said, what are landscape scale collaboratives doing to follow up on the work that we know land trusts and conservancies individually are doing? And Ernest and I came to the quick conclusion that we needed to do a survey in the United States to find out what was going on, what's the baseline is, what the starting point is, and where we can go from there. Let me simply add the editorial comment that, of course, Indigenous people have been stewarding the North American continent for some 12,000 years at least. That is, since the last ice age, at least where I am situated in Massachusetts. And that European settlement really only began about 400 years ago. As a community that is obviously made up of both of those populations today, we've been at the effort of conserving land in a democratic process for about 400 years. And we have gone from protecting land at the village scale, which was first done in Boston in 1634 with the protection of the Boston Common. We eventually, 200 years later, began to move aggressively at the metropolitan scale with works like the Emerald Necklace in Boston and Central Park in New York. That was followed up with efforts at the national scale. For example, at Yellowstone and Yosemite, the first national park examples in the world. And it's really not until the 20th century that we decided that we would take collective action at the international scale. Most notably, I think with regard to climate change, in 2015, when we finally got to an agreement on climate change, and a little bit earlier in 1992 at the Rio conference, when the United Nations formed its Convention on Biological Diversity. Both of those efforts really are two sides of the same coin. They are intertwined inseparably. And the work that all of you are doing at conservancies, at land trusts, at larger collaboratives across North America, and indeed across 6 continents of the globe that we know about at the International Land Conservation Network, this work you're doing is urgent. We have got to get our arms around this in the next several decades, or the Earth will be a place that will not be very welcoming to our great-great-grandchildren. So I congratulate Ernest and his crew on this work. I think that it's worthy of national and international attention. And with that, I turn the microphone over to my friend Ernest Cook, whose paper is there. Yeah.
Jim, thank you very much. As we all know, we're facing tremendous challenges from climate. Is this working? Am I frozen? Can you see me?
You are
Ernest, I think
frozen, Ernest.
You are frozen. I think you need to try sharing your screen again.
That's frozen. Apologies for technical difficulties here. Zoom webinar not responding. I wonder if I need to log in again.
It's possible. Ernest, I can fill in a little bit while you're logging back in, if that would be helpful.
If you would, I think that's what I need to do here.
Let me do so, and simply go to my recollection of the conclusions of your paper, which is that there are a number of landscape scale collaboratives that have responded that climate change is high on their attention list, at least as their strategic planning goes. There is a smaller number who are actually planning initiatives at this time to directly deal with climate change. And there is an even smaller number who are actually engaged in climate change adaptation and mitigation on the ground. We're confident that that number is growing. And really our intent right now is to help stimulate a dialogue that accelerates that growth, because as you all know, biodiversity conservation happens best when it is across a very large landscape. There are increasing indications that around the world that large landscapes are indeed there to be protected, and that biological systems can rebound quite quickly to a state where they're becoming carbon sinks, but it's going to take small groups of dedicated people all over the world who scale up larger and larger to help us meet that 30 by 30 goal that the COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity agreed on just last December in Montreal. The Montreal Protocol that they agreed on began to be negotiated in Kunming, China the year before. Because of COVID, that was carried on into Montreal, where the CBD has its headquarters last December, and a great cheer went up in the conservation community when we finally reached that agreement. But that is, of course, an unenforceable agreement, or it doesn't have any enforcement mechanisms that go along with the agreement. It's a voluntary agreement on the part of countries around the world, and I know for a fact that a great many countries are working on it. We're working on it in the United States. The European Union is working on it with a lot of intensity right now. China has taken notice and is putting in place more and more powerful ways to protect biodiversity in that country. So it's a growing field. The question really is how quickly can we scale up? How quickly can we grow this enterprise so that we protect both biodiversity and the climate in tandem, and have something to pass on to our grandchildren and great-grandchildren. I will say, since we're waiting for Ernest to come back, that there was a really interesting study recently published in Nature Climate Change by a professor at Yale named Oswald Schmitz that forwards the argument very forcefully that ecosystems that have high-level trophic activity, that is, lots of large animals running around on the ecosystem, buffalo in the Great Plains, and otters in marine systems, and great blue whales, and musk oxen, and so on, are much more likely to be active as carbon sinks than the same ecosystems without those high trophic level animals. So animating the climate cycle is one of the things that this community practice is especially well suited to do, given especially our basis in the fish and wildlife community for many of us. And so we ought to think of dealing with protecting animals, especially charismatic megafauna, and addressing climate change as one in the same battle. We're in this together, and I think we all know the stakes, and we're going to work as hard as we can to get there.
Jim, I think
Yeah.
maybe, thank you for that. That was excellent. I think it looks like Ernest is still having a few technical problems. So I think maybe we'll just let Stephanie go first, and then we'll resolve Ernest's issues on the back end and have him speak second to Stephanie. So Stephanie, if you want to share your slides, that would be excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to present today. And we were a recent grantee from the Network for Landscape Conservation's Catalyst Fund. So just coming back from New Mexico last week on a retreat, this is all really fresh in my mind, and it's perfect timing. So thank you all for coming today and for having me here. My name is Stephanie Covino, and I'm the program manager for the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative based at Clark University. So a background of our watershed: we are located in central Massachusetts and northern Rhode Island, and we center along the Blackstone River, which is about almost 50 miles long. And over that distance, it drops almost 450 feet, which is very important for how we used our river, which I'll talk about in a second. Overall, we've got about 475 square miles. So in the national context, we're not a huge landscape collaborative, but for us, it's pretty big. We've got 39 communities over 2 states. We have very urbanized headwaters and very urbanized receiving waters, but in between, we have quite a bit of open space. So we recognize that we are on Indigenous land, and that includes Nipmuc Nation, Pokanoket Nation, Mashpee Wampanoag tribe, and the Narragansett Indian tribe. So we try and work with our tribal partners. We understand, as you mentioned in the land acknowledgement in the beginning, that these partners have been on the landscape and been the traditional original stewards of the land for millennia. We have several resources around this. These two are linked, which we'll get slides later, and they're 2 films, Packatug, Where the River Bends, and Kitticup Speaks, which I encourage you to check out and think about the landscape really from the landscape's point of view, the river from the river's point of view, and thinking about it differently. What we typically hear about our watershed is the American Industrial Revolution. So you heard me say that it's a very steep watershed. It changes quite a bit from the upper headwaters down to Pawtucket. And over that distance, we use that elevation change to dam the river many, many times to create a canal to move goods and create locks to be able to move goods up and down that river. At times, it's been called America's hardest working river and America's most polluted river. There's still a lot of toxic sediments behind our 19 remaining dams on our main stem. And over time, it's been modified, impacted, ignored, and abused. So really our goal right now is on restoration. We have opportunities for conservation as well. You'll see the image on the left is from 1972 from a program called ZAP. It's called ZAP the Blackstone, and it was the largest environmental cleanup in one day in environmental American history. And it's been 51 years now. Last year we had a big celebration for the 50th anniversary. And on that celebration, we paddled down the river. And we still counted 337 tires in our river. And there's a lot more probably that we didn't see, but just to show an example of, there's a lot of opportunity still for restoration here. So over the past 50 years, our watershed has gotten a lot cleaner. A lot of that is due to the Clean Water Act in 1972 and the investment of a lot of our wastewater treatment facilities. As I mentioned, we have these urbanized headwaters and receiving waters, but actually quite a bit of open space in the middle. We know that climate change, I'm sorry, it was paused sharing. Hopefully you could see my slides there. Here we go. Climate change exacerbates everything we do and is very central to our mission. So in a naturalized environment, when it rains, the water soaks into the ground. In a very urbanized environment, it of course goes into our catch basins. So we have lots of impervious surfaces in our urbanized headwater or urbanized areas, adding nutrients to our waterways. Climate change in this region in New England is bringing us increased temperatures. It's warming up our waters. We have a lot of cold water fisheries that are being affected by this. We also have extreme precipitation events, which create really flashy systems and flooding, as well as periods of extended drought. A lot of our communities are already seeing drinking water shortages. The city of Worcester had to spend millions of dollars on purchasing additional reservoir water because our reservoirs went dry. Some private homeowners are experiencing dry wells and having to re-drill their wells. So this is something that we see all the time. We know that healthy communities really depend on a healthy watershed, though, whether it's for recreation and tourism benefits. What happened during COVID, we all were like, we have to get outside. It's so important for physical and mental health. Our built infrastructure and transportation systems really affect our watershed. Think about things like culverts and road stream crossings. If those were to flood and be undersized, which they often are, then that roadway might collapse. We have to think about our municipal services. So we're always trying to think about how we can maintain our natural systems in order to avoid costs, and also think about our most vulnerable residents and how they would be affected by all of these different impacts. We also know that they're not felt equitably, and all these impacts are compounded. So this is a map of our watershed looking at some of our top environmental justice areas. And whether it's heat islands or low tree cover, asthma rates, flooding areas, or low water quality, we see that the same areas are getting impacted again and again and again. And we also see that historically, this region has had a lack of participation and representation in funding opportunities and bringing projects on the ground. And it's not because they don't care. We have very passionate people in our watershed, but it's they lack capacity. So in 2020, the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program got together and said, okay, how can we help? They created this Blackstone River Watershed Needs Assessment Report that identified the 20 different things that we can do to work together on improving climate resilience and water quality. And so the top one was to create a collaborative. So in 2021, we started this collaborative. We meet monthly. We have about 125 different organizations that participate and have all committed to, I want to work on this. And that includes about 200 plus individuals. We usually have about 30 people on our monthly calls. And we get together and say, what can we work on with it, whether it's technical assistance and capacity gaps, helping to prioritize projects, providing funding to small organizations, or being the one who can manage those funds. We're also just a local place to celebrate successes and to go when there's a problem. So people know if there's something related to the Blackstone, they can come to our meeting, they can talk to me, I can be the face of this, and we'll get them to where they need to be. So some of the goals that we've all committed to are enhancing the water quality monitoring program that we already have, creating equitable access along our riverways. We don't have a lot of access. This river is often hidden behind a highway or a steep slope or poison ivy. So we want to be able to increase access and make sure that all communities have equitable access. We want to manage water chestnut, which is an aquatic invasive that's taking over a lot of our lakes and ponds, as well as enhance our bikeway and greenway. So currently we are trying to get it to run all the way from Worcester, Massachusetts to Providence, Rhode Island. We have pieces of it that are still coming along. Enhance aquatic connectivity. I talked about the dams that are on the river. We also have an estimated 5,000 culverts that are, most of which undersized within our watershed. So there's a lot of opportunity there. And also creating fish passage over our lowest of the 4 dams. And I'll talk about that in just a second. Some of the events and trainings that we have had include last summer, I mentioned paddling the river. So in this photo you see on the far left, EPA Regional Administrator for New England, David Cash. He came on this paddle with us. We got to show him our river and talk about our priorities. We met with the director of the Department of Environmental Management. We met with wastewater treatment plant officials. We've held tours of the combined sewer overflow facility in Worcester. People didn't really understand, how does this contributing to water quality in our environment? How can we talk more about this? We've done cleanups. We worked with the Rhode Island School of Design that helped us do a program where kids and adults wrote letters to the river and apologized to it and said, thank you for all the resources that you provide. We've done culvert trainings and assessments. It's something that we really lack within this region. We have about 50 culverts that have been assessed out of the 5,000. So we're trying to put all those in a regional database. And also this fish migration program. So over the lower 4 dams, we are trying to create fish passage. And we know that the Blackstone, or the Nipmuc word for Blackstone is Kitticook, originally was a tidal river. And now at the very base of where this river starts, there's a dam. That's how we actually define the start of our river. And so we're trying to work with the state and other partners to be able to create passage over these 4 dams at the bottom so that these migratory fish can come back upstream and access a beautiful restored marsh that we have. So we are spreading the message, and just this Sunday, we held a community fish passage parade, which you can see in these pictures here. It was led by 2 of our tribal partners, and there was drumming and dancing and a song about the water and getting just the community involved, because for too long, this project has been trying to be pushed forward, but really it's been happening behind closed doors. So we're trying to make it as transparent and public as possible and really get everyone to support this and be involved. We work on really fun projects, like in Worcester, Massachusetts. We're called a local artists to paint catch basins to get people thinking about where their water goes. And also, Woonsocket, Rhode Island, we had a sewer plant or a wastewater treatment facility that had sewer discharge 3 times in the past year. And so we rallied and said, this can't happen again. We caused a stink, and now there's litigation against that facility to be able to make sure this doesn't happen again, and there's investment. back into that environmental justice community. So not only are we working on the ground with different partners, but we are also making sure that the things we hear on the ground are represented in a larger setting. So we know we are a low capacity watershed. So folks who don't have the time to go to the state meetings or the regional planning agency meetings, we try and do that and make sure that our watershed is represented in this larger decision-making process. So whether that is participating in our regional planning agency's visionary steering committee, I lead a program on nature-based solutions from our Massachusetts Ecosystem Climate Adaptation Network. I participate in the statewide climate change assessment working group, which writes the hazard mitigation and climate adaptation plan for the state. I participate in the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program Steering Committee and the MVP Coalition, which is the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Coalition, and a program that's trying to get more funding to local communities to implement different climate resiliency goals. So that's a kind of an overview of some of the work that I've done, and I really look forward to answering your questions later on. Thank you so much for including me in this case study and in this webinar. Thank you.
That was great, Stephanie. I heard most of that, and I want to apologize to you all for the technical difficulties here. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
This
We
is
hear you,
working now.
Ernest.
Good. Well, let me launch into this. So, as you all know, we're facing challenges from climate change: floods, fire, drought, sea level rise, violent storms, intense heat. This, for those of us in the business of conservation of natural resources, this is a real call to action. First of all, we have to adapt to the impacts of climate change because they're inevitable. Second, we need to mitigate climate change by protecting, restoring, and improved management of land and water to maximize their ability to serve as a carbon sink to remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Now, these strategies are not effective if they're introduced haphazardly or on a localized basis. Nature-based climate strategies must be implemented on a landscape scale. And a landscape scale approach requires taking action that crosses political and cultural boundaries, integrating the efforts of government agencies, nonprofit organizations, and landowners. That is a job for landscape conservation partnerships. The Network for Landscape Conservation, which I'm the director of, specializes in research and support to landscape conservation partnerships. That's why we welcome the invitation from the Lincoln Institute to conduct this research and to prepare this paper. Our research began with an online survey of landscape conservation partnerships that took place a little over a year ago, actually. That survey identified 128 partnerships who said that they were active in some form of climate action conservation. So working with some graduate students at the University of Montana, we followed up with a few dozen of those partnerships that we thought were most likely to have significant activities that we wanted to get information about. And it was interesting, as we dug deeper into our interviews, it turned out that many of the partnerships who indicated that they were addressing climate change were not really making any major changes in their operations. They knew that land conservation was an important contributor to climate action. They weren't really being very intentional or changing their strategies. On the other hand, there were several partnerships that explicitly recognized the challenges of climate change and are facing them head on. So we profiled many of these partnerships in the report. Overall, I'd say that the landscape conservation community is in the midst of a transition toward taking more responsibility for the issue of climate change. And we hope that our report will hasten that transition. As Jim pointed out, time's a wasting. So I'd like to highlight just a few of the partnerships that are taking aggressive, effective action by sharing a couple of slides here. Did that work?
Yes, they just need to be in presentation in slideshow view.
Yeah. There we go. All right. Again, we had 128 of our survey respondents that identified climate adaptation or mitigation as a principal focus. We really found maybe half of them seem to have a really intentional strategy. One of the really excellent strategies that we found was run by the Heisted Foundation, which manages a regional conservation partnership network. There are a few dozen landscape conservation partnerships that are in this network. And the Heisted Foundation brought them together along with data from the Nature Conservancy on resilient and connected landscapes. A lot of you have probably heard of this, extremely important data set for anybody involved in landscape conservation, as well as some data from the Open Space Institute. And really interesting that once this important climate data was integrated into their GIS priority system, you can see that the areas in red jumped out. They became more important than previously thought, and the areas in blue were actually of decreasing value. So this shows how integrating climate data can really make a big difference. Floodplains by Design is an outstanding program in the state of Washington, where the state legislature is putting aside about $25 million per year in funding for conservation easements, floodplain restorations and buyouts, and management practices that enhance sequestration. They've got multiple partnerships throughout the state that have formed and are making decisions and recommendations about how to spend this money. The Aleutian and Bering Sea Initiative is a really interesting example. This is a marine conservation partnership, and they are in a number of ways adapting technology to manage threats to wildlife. There's something called the geofence technology that produces a heat map of shipping routes near walrus and fur seal haulouts. And because the Arctic ice is melting, those ships going through these waters have more opportunities to interact with and disturb walrus and fur seal populations. The Tri-State Conservation Partnership is active in Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. They are coordinating funding to largely restore bottomland hardwood forests. And they have completed to date restoration and planting of hundreds of thousands of acres of wetland restoration, which is extremely valuable for wildlife, but also is recreating a tremendous carbon sink in the alluvial valley of the Mississippi. Baltimore Wilderness Coalition operates on a regional scale, and it goes from kind of regional resources and landscapes to the suburbs and all the way into the inner city. It's a terrific example of a landscape conservation partnership that has really integrated urban considerations into their work. So there's one of the partners in the Baltimore Wilderness Coalition is the Baltimore Tree Trust. They have an explicit climate strategy that is to expand the urban tree canopy, because studies have shown that the heat in the ambient heat in inner city neighborhoods is many degrees greater than in the more kind of suburban locations. Here, I think Roland Park is an example. Compared to Broadway East, you can see the differential in the heat issues affecting this area. So not only are they cooling neighborhood streets, but also filtering water going into the bay and building a green workforce. I think this is my final slide. Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape, very large section of the Florida Panhandle so this is a relatively new Sentinel landscape, and one of their principal goals is to improve resilience to coastal storms. Hurricane Michael came barreling through this area a year or two ago and virtually destroyed Tyndall Air Force Base. So there are a lot of very interesting efforts being made to reduce the vulnerability to coastal storms. And with that, I'm done. So I just want to close with a couple of observations from our paper. Overall, I'd say that every landscape conservation partnership has a duty to put climate change front and center in its strategy. And I'd say also that every climate action plan prepared should include landscape conservation as one of its strategies. Really interesting observation is that technology is what has enabled many of these landscape initiatives to collaborate. You know, the iPhone was only introduced in 2007, and Zoom didn't become available until 2013. So these partnerships are now using that technology and much more advanced technology to communicate and collaborate. I'm sure we'll be seeing artificial intelligence applications before too long. Another point, connectivity is essential to resilience. That theme emerged again and again in our research. Another point, we tend to look to the federal government for leadership in promoting natural climate solutions and conservation partnerships, but there are great models like floodplains by design that have been developed at the state level that could be adopted more broadly. And finally, I'd say we have a long way to go in integrating cities and environmental justice issues into our landscape conservation initiatives. So we had a great example from the Baltimore Wilderness Coalition, and also a great presentation from the Blackstone Watershed Collaborative that highlighted some of those issues. That's it from.
Thank you, Ernest.
You are welcome.
I believe that it's my responsibility now to take over and moderate and take questions. I invite the members of the audience to put their questions into the webinar chat, and we will read them and have our panelists answer them for you. I've got a couple of starter questions that I can ask. Stephanie, I had the chance to work with Bill Levitt and David Foster at the Heisted Foundation for quite a while. And one of the things I learned, especially from Bill, is that landscape scale conservation collaboratives really often need hubs. They need places that day in and day out are working on connecting everybody together and making sure that there was communication and that there were events going on and that the flow kept going. In your Blackstone Watershed Collaborative, I believe I learned from your presentation that the hub is at Clark University. How is that funded? How is that run? How central is that to your mission?
Yeah, it's a great question. So the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program is one of the 20-ish estuary programs throughout the United States. So it's a federal one. And they're the ones that sort of identified that there was a need to do this. And it's exactly what you said, to bring people together, to have these meetings. And as you know, you're working on all sorts of different stuff as a collaborative. I'm talking about climate resilience, I'm talking about fish passage, I'm talking about combined sewer overflows and green infrastructure and stormwater management. And there's a lot on your plate. And at one point I was like, okay, collaborative members, can we just meet bi-monthly? And everyone said, no, we need you. You have to do monthly. There's so much going on, and this is our opportunity to share information. So we definitely have that need for one centralized location for people to kind of come together and share what's going on and keep up to date. And when NBEP decided, okay, this is important, well, I mean, with their 2 years of community outreach, everyone decided this was important. They put out an RFP, and different organizations submitted a proposal to say, we want to host the collaborative, whatever it looks like. And Clark University was chosen from the RFP as the one to host this program. So I live at the George Perkins Marsh Institute, which focuses on this sort of people-nature interaction. And it's a good partnership that allows me to work directly with students and really have an influence on some of their education and bringing them into sort of the real world of what does climate practitioners do, and be involved in all of these different stakeholder groups that I'm a part of. And it's also really useful for me that I get to steal a lot of their GIS capabilities, because Clark University is known for its geospatial technology. It also is great because Clark has the financial resources to be able to manage these larger grants that we are bringing in and hope to bring in into the future. So it's a good partnership there, but really it's a need for all of the different partners to come together.
And how is it funded?
Good question. Yeah, sorry, missed that part. So the Narragansett Bay Estuary Program provided the first year of seed funding, which is federal funding from EPA. And then from there, we've gotten a diversity of funds, most of which are EPA through one avenue or another. So some of it is from the Southeast New England program, which is an EPA program. We also have Southeast New England program SNP network, which provides technical assistance and pays me as a provider to provide technical assistance directly to communities. And we've also gotten funding through the Catalyst Fund from the Network for Landscape Conservation, as well as another anonymous private foundation. So we're very excited that we are expanding. And as of June 14th, we'll be hiring a second person, doubling our staff capacity, because we're asked to do so much for communities and one person doesn't have the capacity to provide all that assistance. So we're hoping to really be able to do more for our communities now.
Great. Again, I invite the audience to submit questions to, and here is the first one from David Clutter to everyone. Could someone please speak to the role of capacity building and collaboration development? For instance, does there tend to be a lead partner that facilitates and leads? Really, that's following on what we were just talking about. Ernest, do you want to take
Absolutely. Collaboratives come in a variety of forms. Some of them do have clearly a lead partner.
Ernest, you're beginning to fade out. If you could come closer to the microphone, that would help.
Technical problems here. Is it better, Jim?
That's a little better. Yeah.
Okay. In the case of the Northwest Florida Sentinel landscape that I mentioned, there is that is kind of inspired and funded by largely by the Department of Defense, although they're joined by NRCS and Fish and Wildlife Service. So that's kind of a led, very much a creative, led collaborative. But then there are some collaboratives that are really totally grassroots and grow up from the bottom. So that don't necessarily have a lead partner, where there really is a totally shared collaborative planning and decision-making process.
Okay. Stephanie, do you want to add to that at all?
Yeah, so I mentioned Mass ECAN briefly, and that is a group run by UMass Amherst. It's the Massachusetts Ecosystem Climate Adaptation Network. So it's just at this perfect intersection of land and climate. And we have a number of different working groups to kind of talk about different topics. One's on salt marsh migration and forest health and nature-based solutions and climate communications. And we have a subgroup that specifically started looking at watershed scale climate collaboration. And we just released a story map recently that looks at this topic. And I know, as you mentioned, Jen, the RCP network, so the collaborative is also an RCP, has done some similar work looking at collaboratives. And what I've found there is that there's a no one size fits all. We have about 10 different collaboratives just in Massachusetts. We are leading the nation on this, or it's pretty exciting that all three of us are also all sitting in Massachusetts right now. So we have them led at regional planning agencies. We have some led by universities, from watershed associations, from land trusts, Some have started their own nonprofit. Some were started with municipalities getting funding and not knowing how to work together beyond their borders. So there's really no one size fits all, and I will get you the link to that, that story map in just a second.
Okay.
Great.
So Joanne McIntyre, and I've got a couple of, well, now the questions are starting to come in. Okay, thank you. Joanne McIntyre asks, can you comment on the role of FEMA in a disaster context, and if they are able or willing to collaborate in partnerships? It seems that their long-range planning program could be useful, or funding, they might be useful in terms of providing funding for implementation. Can either of you comment on the presence or absence of FEMA in these kind of initiatives?
I'd be happy to take a start at that. FEMA is increasingly recognizing the role of nature-based solutions in managing, reducing hazards and risks of climate change. They are a very active partner, for example, in the floodplains by design program in the state of Washington. I still think, though, that FEMA programs have a ways to go. We need to be more anticipating the hazards of climate change, the storms, the floods, the fires, the droughts, rather than being reactive. So much of the FEMA funding does come in the form of kind of disaster relief after the fact. So there's room for improvement, but there has been a lot of improvement in recent years.
All right. Stephanie, anything to add to that on FEMA? No. Okay.
I was just going to say that I used to be the conservation agent for the city of Worcester. And while I was there, we moved up our community rating system from a 9 to a 7, and it is so much work. So a shout out to everybody that works on floodplain mitigation. It's such a challenge, and it's such a need for non-floodplain managers to understand the basics of. So we actually have a webinar coming out about that this summer, I think June 21st or 22nd. With one of my partners on floodplain management for non-floodplain managers. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me.
Yeah, I do want to mention, Jim, that I think there's nobody who is really seriously dealing with the long-term threats of sea level rise. I mean, there are going to be whole communities that have to be relocated. Tremendous pullback from the water's edge, with trillions of dollars of real estate at risk. And it seems to me that at some point FEMA is going to have to play a much bigger role in that, and will require bucket loads of money.
Yeah, there was a story yesterday, not on sea level rise, but on heat in urban areas, that said that if Phoenix, Arizona experienced 2 days of very hot weather and a blackout simultaneously, which is the two things sometimes go together, that there could be 880,000 people presenting themselves for medical care at emergency rooms.
Yeah.
Which is a unimaginable number of people to try to take care of all at once. So I think some of these very unpleasant surprises, may come upon us in years to come, and the more work we do now to prepare with FEMA or without FEMA, the better off our communities are going to be. I have a question from Jamie Thibodeau, who asks, I run a landscape coordination program that divides Minnesota into 6 regions. I find that the regions with intact landscapes and lots of public land struggle sometimes to collaborate, and they focus therefore more on informational presentations. What's been your trick on getting folks motivated to action and collaboration? And I will add to that question, are we still struggling in parts of the country with people who deny the reality of climate change? And how do you begin to deal with that?
I think there is growing acceptance. I don't know that it's universal yet, but pretty widespread that climate change is happening. There is more disagreement about sort of the causes of climate change and whether release of greenhouse gases by human activity is the principal villain in the story. But so there are many landscape conservation collaboratives operating in parts of the country where the idea of human-induced climate change is not very easy to talk about. So they just focus on the impact, the reality of what is happening, the droughts, the floods, the fires, and so on. Now, to get people to collaborate, I'd be interested to know get Stephanie's perspective on this, but I think people just need to see that they have a common interest and that by working together, they can coordinate and make more effective use of their resources and have a greater impact. Now that I know in some situations it seems like it should come together and it just doesn't. I think it takes sometimes a visionary spark, a leadership from someone to get people to understand their common interest. It doesn't succeed everywhere, unfortunately.
Stephanie, you want to take that on?
So we are very fortunate in Massachusetts. So we have a program that started from an executive order about 6 years ago, and it's called the Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program, or the MVP program. And it allowed communities to apply for funding very specifically to hire a facilitator that was trained in this specific process that was created by the Nature Conservancy called the Community Resilience Building process. I'll get a link for that too in a minute. And the communities went through and said, okay, what are our hazards? What's getting worse because of climate change? And what are our vulnerabilities and strengths, thinking about infrastructure, environment, and society? And you fill out this matrix and you think about what your goals are. And at the end, you're supposed to come out with this prioritized list of actions that would reduce your vulnerability to climate change. And in the beginning, we were like, oh, how are we going to talk about climate change in some of these communities? A lot of people think about Massachusetts as a very blue state. We often have Republican governors. We often have a lot of conservative communities in our region. And so it is a question that we have. But because we've had this funding, not just in the planning process, but then the states come out with millions of dollars in funding for implementation of those goals on a municipal by municipal basis, the story has changed so much. So 5 years ago, even, you had to be really careful and you had to say, well, okay, I'm not going to say climate change. I'm going to say, where do you experience flooding? Where are your community, safety challenges about public safety? Where does your fire department get called out to a lot? And you just sort of like tweaked the message a little bit. And now you can just walk in and be like, all right, climate change, we're going to address this. And it's completely changed the tone of how we talk about this in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, because they've also said, hey, Mass, you've done a good job with that program, and has created their own, the Municipal Resilience Building, MRP program, again, based off of the Nature Conservancy's Community Resilience Building program. So that's kind of how we talk about it. And in terms of getting people going and saying like, okay, join our collaborative, it can be a challenge. I find that I work with the people who want to work with me. And so there are certain players that you say, you really need to be in the room. I'm going to go get our state official and encourage them to come and show them why it's important. But community by community, it's those who are interested and really want to work with me, whether they have the capacity to or not. So we try and reach out specifically to some groups, and then just kind of try and find the momentum and run with it. And when you can show some progress, people get excited about it, and then they want to kind of join in. But it can be really challenging. I'm very lucky that I have a very, excitable, passionate group of people that I get to work with.
All right, I think I have time for one more question, then we're going to have to head towards beginning to close this out. Simon Rucker asked the following: can one of the panelists talk about funding in other regions like the Florida Sentinel landscape? Do different regions depend on different revenue sharing? And Ernest, I know that you have quite a bit of experience along the Gulf and in the Rocky Mountain West. So if you could talk a little bit about different sources of revenue in different parts of the country?
Well, the Northwest Florida Sentinel landscape is, I guess, particularly blessed because they have a state program that has a lot of funding available for land conservation. They also have access to Deepwater Horizon settlement funds. You know that oil well exploded over 10 years ago, but the stream of payments that resulted from British Petroleum runs for like 20 years. So they're still using that settlement funds from the oil well explosion. There are federal funds that are coming into the picture. So one of the great tasks and responsibilities of the Northwest Florida Coalition and the coordinator is to try to package all these to make sense of them. There are other parts of the country that don't have anything like that array of opportunities, and it can be a real struggle. There are many very rural parts of the country where the capacity of local governments and even state governments is so constrained that it's very difficult to patch together the kind of funding they need. There's also kind of a lack of I wish there were more philanthropic support specifically for collaborative conservation. But so it's all over the map.
It is indeed all over the map. All right, I have one more question from Jen, and I think this is really important as well, which is the question of scale of initiative. Landscape conservation groups operate at a variety of scales. Does the spatial scale of work that landscape collaboratives do help or hinder incorporating climate into their climate work? And I will add to that, is there significance to very small scale projects in places like Baltimore neighborhoods that can be similarly effective to ones that cover very large parts of the state of Montana, for example? And you're both nodding your heads, so I'm going to let you both respond to that. Stephanie, why don't you go first?
Sure. Yeah. So that link that I shared about watershed scale climate collaboratives talks about this sort of, if you work in watersheds, this Huck 8, Huck 10 kind of level is what we call the Goldilocks scale, because it's not so big that it's overwhelming. It's small enough that you kind of have an ability to make an impact on a bigger kind of scale, but you also are small enough that you know your communities and you can have that really deep engagement on the ground with folks. And so we think that scale works really well. And there's some research from UMass Amherst on this that supports that. And we have a lot of watershed scale climate collaboratives in Massachusetts, but I'm always impressed by folks that can work across like 5 states out in the Western regions that have these much bigger landscapes. So I think it depends on where you are and what kind of landscape you're looking at.
Ernest?
Yeah, I think that it's important to stay kind of close to the ground. Now, there are some very large scale partnerships. Think about the Delaware River Watershed Initiative or the Appalachian Landscape Collaborative that are effective because they serve as an umbrella for many kind of more locally based conservation collaboratives. So once you kind of get beyond a certain geographic size, I'd say it's important to kind of spawn a number of more, geographically focused elements to your work.
Right. I always like to say that large landscape conservation is a little bit like t-shirts in that it comes in many different sizes. It can be extra small, medium, large, triple XL. Yeah. And all of those things are important. So I'm gonna, because by my clock, we're 1 minute before the turn of the hour. I am going to wrap this up and thank the two of you who are pioneers in trying to get large landscape collaboratives to focus on this issue, which is integrally tied to the future of their landscapes. Just protecting wildlife habitats by themselves is not gonna be sufficient. Just focusing on climate change and avoiding the biodiversity challenges is also not being sufficient. And you're both grappling ably with this tremendous challenge that we have. And I just hope that lots of people follow the pioneering work that you're both doing right now. Now, Jen, I know there is a follow-on webinar to this. I am trying to find my notes that explain when that is, but I know you have it on the top of your head. So do you want to come in and try to speak to the next time to tune in to this series?
Yes, thank you for that. And thank you, Ernest and Stephanie and everyone for attending. June 29th, I just dropped the link in the chat for the whole webinar series. You can use that to find the registration for the next webinar and keep up to date on the follow-on webinars from there. Thanks again to our speakers and our moderator and for all of your time and attention today.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.